We're glad you could join us on this discussion of our editorial processes, methods, tools, techniques, and management science for Project Management Journal. I'm Gary Klein, and along with Ralph Mueller, we are the co-editors-in-chief of Project Management Journal. What we are interested in accomplishing with this editorial is to describe how an approach using operations research or on practice methods can achieve the contemporary contribution that we are seeking for publication. This is the next in an editorial series that we have designed to help authors prepare their papers for publication in the Project Management Journal. We started a couple of years ago with describing contemporary contributions and followed that up with a couple of papers on describing the qualitative and the quantitative requirements in the write-ups. We also then described literature review expectations, both from the standpoint of writing a literature review paper, as well as in any paper establishing the need and setting up the research question for the study. Lastly, we include some discussions on plagiarism, which has still been a significant problem in many submissions we receive. If we go back to the origins of project management, it did grow out of the fields of management science or operations research. But since that time, the scope of project practice has been constantly expanding. And the research that we conduct as academics needs to follow that expansion or even lead that expansion going forward. Still, we're still interested in the formal models and the processes that meet the broader expectations of today's project managers. Efficiency and effectiveness is still an important issue for many of them, and a lot of that still derives from the operations, research, and management science approaches and the formal methods and practices. But we still need that research along those lines to be a contemporary contribution. In achieving a contemporary contribution, what we consider is winding up at the end of the paper with an explanation, with an answer to a why question. So an interesting research question is very important to start with. A research question that simply ends in a mathematical solution to a particular problem is generally not broad enough to be interesting to the readership of the Project Management Journal. Once we have a good research question, we then need to root that in the existing literature and theory. I would suggest considering our past editorial on literature reviews to help construct the proper review for the purpose of a paper. The next thing is to creatively shape the model. And this is the heart of the matter typically in operations research. The creation of a model requires the same functions that any theoretical development does when it's done properly. Any variables of interest have to be identified and justified. And if there is some backing theory that helps explain why those variables were chosen, that's what is essential. In the math program, for example, these often appear in the objective function. Why were those variables chosen? Well, is it just for a very narrow application, or is it because some theory is telling you the best objective to approach, the best goal to seek in your math program? The next thing is theories talk about relationships between variables and among variables. Those have to be established. In a math program, again, Those relationships could appear in constraints. You also have boundaries in theories, the context, the who, the where, the when of a theory. Again, those could be in the constraints of an operations research model. Lastly, what you have to do is surface the reasoning behind any relationship to justify the logic of the development of your model. It's the why, the reasoning of the model, that makes it more of a contemporary contribution. That's what adds value to the readers of Project Management Journal, as opposed to a narrow management science model that can only be applied to one or two problems around the globe. The model really is just an artifact. It's used to predict improved performance or other outcomes. And then it does require demonstration that it's a valid application. It has to be a true application. It cannot just be a fabricated one or a reduced application, because all you've done then is create a tutorial. You have not created a contribution. The last thing is to define and position the contribution. How have you applied the theory and extended it to generate a model? And after all, your model, that's all it is. It's an application of some theoretical principles to help you solve a problem. No different than if you develop a structural equation model to test the behavioral aspects of a project team or similar nature. Well, we do have a history of accepting papers that apply operations research techniques or that look at formal processes for the practice of project management. For example, the systems approach to project stakeholder management, fuzzy cognitive map modeling. The authors develop a process to follow, and they validate the process with an in-depth case study. They also do a formal analysis of stakeholder comments that provide insights that validate the particular technique that they've described and that they propose. In a method for risk response planning and project portfolio management, there's a mathematical programming model derived from both practice and theory that serves as a tool to study risk response planning and derive some generalizations. There are other examples, a couple listed here, and others published even within the last few years. So operations research papers are accepted. They just cannot be a narrow problem domain, and they follow all of these basic principles. They address a real-world problem. They discover and report on current thought. They relate to theory. They justify the research strategies and methodological choices. They provide convincing validation of the model to be more general, and they describe the insights and implications to both research and practice. Okay, for further information, you can seek out the editorial from which this presentation is derived. It provides a little bit more detail. It describes a couple of more examples that are published in the journal. It does mention design science research as a potential approach that you might take towards an operations research paper for Project Management Journal. But you can go to these websites that are listed here. The Project Management Institute has information about our journal. We reside on Sage Publications. We do have this YouTube page, which you obviously located. You can join our LinkedIn group or Twitter as a follower in order to stay current and receive updates. Once again, thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to receiving a number of submissions that make good contributions applying operations research methodologies.